Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mariana, and I'm the Program Manager for Speakers Bureau at Humanities Washington. I'm delighted to host this Women's History Month conversation. And today we're joined by two of our Speakers Bureau presenters whose talk offer unexpected and fascinating windows into women's lives. If you want to learn more about their bios or book them for a talk, please visit our website. So I'm pleased to present Diane Johnston, whose talk this roster is titled Hidden Layers, Women's Undergarments and How They Shaped Ladies' Liberties. And in it, she explores how women's underwear, from corsets to modern styles, reflects shifting ideas about modesty, mobility, beauty, and autonomy. And Teresa Andre, who's taught this roster, is titled Pavement and Plucky Girls, 19th, 20s Tales from Washington's First Highway. And in it, she takes us on the early road of the 1920s, where advancement in transportation offered new freedoms, especially to young women who challenged expectations by simply getting behind the wheel. So although their subjects seem to be a little different, both of their talks reveal how everyday choices, meaning what women wear and where women go, can really spark change. So today is an opportunity to explore and talk about that change, as well as the stories, challenges, shortcomings, and wins that have shaped women's histories. So thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you.
So I want to start off with a question just to start the conversation. So as I mentioned, both of your talks look at everyday things, right? Underwear and early road travel. And both of these things we were sort of mentioning sparked a lot of change and also debate in women's lives. So can you both share a little bit more about, talk a little bit more about this change, but also the debates surrounding such changes? So Diane, can you start us off, please? Thank you.
Sure. Well, an easy one to choose is the corset. Most people are familiar with kind of what a corset looks like, but the garment itself was originally designed to help support the weight of the breasts. And we actually see them dating back to 1600 BCE. And so ancient times, women were creating some kind of a support system that was worn around the torso that would help to support the breasts. And so when it first started out, it was just a garment that served a very practical purpose. But as we move through history, we start to see that people are figuring out, hey, this garment can actually reshape my body to make it more look like whatever the idealized style is of that time. And so that's when we start to see corsetry changing from a supportive, practical garment to something that is actually reshaping a woman's body. And so, again, because a lot of people know about corset history, this is an easy one to kind of trace through time and see how it was then utilized to create a tighter waist. And again, going back farther than you would expect, a small waist was seen as the ideal. And now it's possible it's because it makes the bust look more prominent and it makes the hips look more prominent, which are both features of female anatomy that people are excited about. And so as we move through history, we start to see that the corset is utilized to change the shape of the body to get closer to what is seen as this ideal shape with a smaller waistline. Now, over the years, the bust changed from being squashed up against the body when it was not as popular to have a large bust line to actually pushing the breast tissue up and over the garment when it was popular to have a very large bosom. And so we start to see that through history as well. But then again, it continues to change, and the corset starts to be utilized as a garment that's actually beginning to deform women's bodies rather than just reshape them visually. And so there's some historians who have seen that people thought corsets were healthy and utilized those to reshape what they thought were physical deformities. And so if a child had, for example, scoliosis and had a curvature of the spine, they could put a corset on the child to help correct that so that they would have an easier posture to live with at that time. And so corsetry was used for both girls and boys in different times through history. But it did kind of focus more on women as we got closer to the history that's closer to us. So in Western Europe and in the United States, we started to see corsets used to gain an unnatural waistline. And so when we think of those movies where we see the woman hanging onto the bedpost and someone else is pulling on this, pulling on the laces, trying to get it as tight as possible, that's when we start to see a very unhealthy use of the corsets, because by pulling in the waistline, there's nowhere for your organs to go. So all of your internal organs end up being shoved up into your chest cavity, and then there's no room for those to develop properly, especially if you begin corseting girls at a young age, which was common through the 1800s, 1900s, as corsets were being utilized. And so we're actually changing where the organs sit within the body. We're not allowing the organs to develop properly. And then it actually went to an extreme where some women were having their lower ribs removed so that they could get the corset even tighter for that small waistline that was in vogue. And so as we start to see the use of corsetry to alter the body shape, we have some really unhealthy things happening. And then moving forward, women with pregnancy at that time were not to show the pregnancy in public. And so it was seen as indecent to walk around with a full pregnant belly. And so if you still wanted to go out and go to a party or go to the market or go for a walk, you had to hide your pregnancy. And so corsets were also used then to push the baby into the body cavity so that the front belly area was not showing the pregnancy. And so we start to see extremely high rates of miscarriages happening because there's no room for the development of the fetus. So we have miscarriages happening because there's no place for baby to go. And so once you started showing, then you would just stay at home until you had the baby. And so we start to see a garment that started out as a fantastic support device that probably offered really nice lumbar support as well, if you think about the lumbar belts that we had. But moving through history, it's then turned into a device to create a fashion and a visual look that people wanted at that time. And then it goes to an extreme where it's utilized to actually reshape and reform the body in ways that were physically detrimental for women and then also for mothers. So it's interesting to see how that has changed. But then, we get to a point where women are like, nope, nope, nope. So that's an answer to another question.
Thank you so much, Diane. Teresa, please.
Okay, so the program that I have is called Pavement and Plucky Girls. So I wanted to start with some of the debate over pavement. And you'd wonder, why would anybody consider a good paved road to be controversial? Doesn't make sense to me that everybody likes good roads. You don't want potholes, you don't want dirt roads. But it actually was pretty controversial because there was a debate over who's going to pay for good interstate roads. Is this a federal issue? Because it's an internal improvement in the different states. And so for many years, the federal government stepped back and said, states, that's your problem. You figure it out. But things started to change as cars become more readily available. And as cars start coming out onto the roads, well, first off, we've got the Good Roads movement that starts in 1879 by people riding bicycles. But cars just, they took over. There were only about 200,000 cars in 1912. But by the time we get to 1923, there's 3 million cars on the road. So we've got to do something. We've got to pave these, but there's still some controversy over there. So there's the financial difficulties, but then there was the perception of public safety. Cars are dangerous. And oh, you can't have women driving cars. That would be way too dangerous to have women driving cars. So before the 1920s, you start to see articles in newspapers that are labeling drivers as reckless, that are developing a myth that women can't handle driving, and then making a spectacle of anything that might have been wrong, any problem. If there was a car accident in your city, because you probably don't have traffic lights yet, then the wrecked up cars would be put on a wagon and paraded through town, showing you, look, this is dangerous stuff. We can't have these highways because people will just drive faster and farther, and we can't have that. But by the 19 teens and the early 1920s, people aren't buying that much anymore. They're starting to want to get on the road and to move. And there's a big perception that out west is amazing. We need to send people out west. Go west, young man is becoming even more the thing. And there's movies being made about the Wild West. People want to come out. And there's national parks. Yellowstone National Park is one of the biggest attractions that's being advertised back east. Well, you've got to get there. So business stepped in where the government did not. Business stepped in and they formed associations. And the first one was called the Yellowstone Trail Association, capitalizing on Yellowstone Trail. And they created, it's kind of like the AAA of today. They created maps, they created brochures, they got towns, villages, cities to buy into their association. They got businesses to buy into their association. They got campgrounds to buy into it. And then they would have people join the association. You could join it for $1 a year. And then you could purchase these maps that would tell you how to go all the way from Boston, Massachusetts to Seattle, Washington. By 1915, the trail was across the country. There were other trails that came quickly after that. The most common one was called the Lincoln Trail. But by the end, we've got 250 trails. By the end of the 1920s, all of these trails going all over the place, all over the country. It was a little chaotic, but it worked. Now, in Washington, we had some debates going on here because where's the trail going to go? The trail started in the east and came west. It came in at Spokane, but now what? The easiest way to get across this, well, the shortest way to get across the state is a northern route. The easiest way with the most developed roads at the time was to go a southern route down to Walla Walla and then up to Seattle. So that's what they decided to do because those roads were the best paved, but the northern route was not happy, which kicked into people complaining to the state legislature, to their local communities. The northern route ended up paving more roads, straightening out some of those hairpin turns. And now we've got a northern route. So there's two of them. With the southern route, there was another big brouhaha. Portland said, oh, all of these tourists are coming. We want them to go to Portland and not Seattle. So they tried to bribe the Yellowstone Trail Association to change the end of the trail to Portland rather than Seattle. Seattle said, no, are you kidding me? We are the end of the trail. Seattle, I don't know if there was money involved, but Seattle ended up being the end of the trail. So I think I can get more into some of our plucky girls with some of your other questions, but I never expected paving roads to be this controversial.
Yes, please, let's dive in. So I'm just, very interested in, on the one hand, right, we have the question about when did women actually start pushing back against these things that were imposed upon them, right? On the one hand, undergarments that are incredibly uncomfortable and actually dangerous, right? And then on the other hand, right, this sort of stereotype of women can't drive, right? It's dangerous for them to drive. They shouldn't get behind the wheel, which is actually something that we, still have today, right? The idea that women can't drive. So when did this start to change, and how did women, sort of like regain agency and said no? So Teresa, let's start with you first.
Okay, so going back to way back, we're going to go back to the Victorian era first. Technically, the Victorian era ended in 1901, but the Victorian era set a lot of the attitudes that just persisted for years and years and years. My dad was born in 1919, and he was appalled at the fact that women would pump their own gas because women just didn't do that. They're not capable of doing that. But the Victoria era, part of what they said, and they established it with experts, is that women weren't capable of doing a lot of things. We were the weaker sex. We were frail. We're timid. We're easily shocked and we're easily exhausted. So cranking a car is just beyond our physical capabilities. And this was the experts. The doctors were saying it. Your professors in school, your ministers and your politicians were all reinforcing this notion. But women weren't really buying into it. And as cars became more popular, at first there was the gas combustible car, but there were also early electric cars. So wealthy women in particular wanted to be able to get out of the house. And so it was allowed for wealthy women to have an electric car. And the electric car couldn't go very far, couldn't go very fast, and most of the time couldn't make it up hills. But that was an acceptable ladies' vehicle, and the only ones that could afford it were the wealthy. Well, women were really not going to put up with this. And they soundly rejected that notion. And by 1915, when the Yellowstone Trail made it to Washington, only 2% of cars that were manufactured were these electric cars, and they faded out completely by 1938. So think of golf carts now, those kind of cars. But since the women rejected that idea, women were on the forefront of saying, we can do this. It is not out of the realm of possibility that we can drive. In fact, we're going to be very good at it. And they started setting things in place to help this come about. In 1916, we're right on the verge of entering the Great War, World War II. And I think the leadership of the Girl Scouts saw this as an opportunity because in 1916, they started a badge that Girl Scouts could earn that was called the automobiling badge. And in order to earn that badge, the young women needed to demonstrate that they could drive. They needed to demonstrate they had a basic understanding of auto mechanics, and they also had to have first aid. So that kind of taking it, we're going to teach our young women that they can drive because we're probably going to need them. And sure enough, we get involved in World War I, the Great War, and now women need to step up. They're becoming truck drivers, streetcar drivers. They're driving the ambulances that are needed. They're taking over these jobs that the men aren't there to do. Well, the men come back from the war, and women are saying, we kind of like this. We like the freedom and we are capable. You've seen what we did during the war. We can do this. Now, media managed to shape a lot of what we think. And now we think in terms of the internet, various websites, blogs, podcasts. Well, back then, the major media that was aimed at women took up this mantle that women could have freedom through driving. Ladies' Home Journal and Home and Garden Magazine all started producing articles that were extolling the virtues of driving and encouraging women to learn to drive. And they would do things like say, to make it a little bit more palatable, particularly to men, they would say things like, it is good mothering to take children to a park. And if you can drive, you can go to a park with your children. And as many of the cars were more open air at the time, this is a better way for your child to get fresh air if you can drive and take them in. And women, of course, love that. But the other thing that really shapes the way we think is Hollywood. Movies were they were such a treat. They were the kind of thing that you wanted to go to the movies. And of course, you had your silent film stars. And we had our very own silent film star. She came from Yakima. Granted, she moved away as a child, but we're going to claim her. Her name was Barbara Lamar, and she was considered the girl who was too beautiful for Hollywood. And she was driving in the movies, as were a lot of these other silent film women, driving cars, many of them doing their own stunt work. And that, of course, just added to the mystique and the intrigue and emphasizing the competence of women driving. So I kind of think it's a little, I don't even know what word to use, maybe a little ironic that Barbara's third husband decided he wanted to punish her. And so he took away her car Yeah, Barbara had a fourth husband.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm glad Barbara had a fourth husband. So anyway, Detroit saw what was happening, and they saw these trends, and of course, they would like to capitalize on this. So they saw the sales potential, and they started using women in their advertisements, and they also started designing cars to be sleeker, to have more curb appeal, to appeal more to the feminine driver. So when you think about the progression of cars and their bodies, you start with very basic black square, the Model T Ford, and then you get into roadsters. And the other thing they started doing is they started subtly putting in their advertisements hints that the affluent and the elite American families need to have two cars. Of course, you need to have two cars. So it's subtly being financially pushed that this is the thing to do for Detroit to make money. But on the same token, I don't like the way they promoted it. One advertisement said, "Our cars are so simple that even a woman can drive them." It's like, okay, thank you. Anyway, there's a newspaper story in 1920 about the two plucky girls from Pullman. And that's one of my favorite stories because they not only challenged some of the social norms, they crushed it. They were driving unescorted, and they offered roadside assistance to some other people that were breaking down along the way. And they changed their own tires, all while having a sense of fun. And when talking with reporters, proudly proclaiming that girls can do anything that they want to do. On the other hand, even with all of this, it's estimated that in the years leading up to the Second World War, less than 1/4 of the United States women had driver's licenses. So we're making progress, but we're making progress slowly.
Thank you, Teresa, so much. Diane,
Yes. Oh gosh, so many there's so many peaks and valleys through history. I think the one thing that I want to remind everyone is that when we're looking back at history, we're looking at it from the perspective of the historians. And so when you think about, looking at Western culture, because that's where our fashion comes from, so I often go back to Western history, we have educated white men of the upper social classes recording the history. And so a lot of the information that they recorded about women's lives or the things that were important to women were written down through their perspective. And so that's one thing to remember when we're looking back in history is who was the author and did they understand the lives of the people they were writing about? And so what's interesting as we see in even modern day, a lot of anthropologists have been men. And so when anthropologists are looking back at how civilizations managed and how people's lives looked, they're looking through a male perspective. And so a lot of women's garments, or just again, the everyday things in women's lives were misinterpreted or completely missed because the men studying these ancient or even 100 years ago societies were not thinking with the experience level that women might have had. And so what's really also then interesting to look at is how society at that time was treating people. And so when we look at gender, today it can be difficult for us to put ourselves in the positions of people in previous times because we just don't have a perception of what that would have been like. So we can imagine, but even imagining is based on our own personal experiences. And so as we start to look back, one of the major points that is so important to keep in mind as we're looking at women's history, and especially fashion history, is that for the majority of the time that humans have been on the planet in Western civilizations, genders were separated. And so clothing was assigned based on your gender at birth. And throughout history, there were times when you could maybe wear some garments that resembled the opposite gender, but for the most part, you were not allowed to wear garments that were not assigned to your gender or your status. And so when we talk about, oh, what could women rebel against these things? They could to a certain extent, but there are also things that never would have occurred to them because they would have been so far beyond their experience level that it wouldn't have seemed possible. Kind of like we think about all these science fiction things, that would never have been possible. And now we've got, Apple Watches, and, we've got self-driving cars and all of these things that people had imagined. When we look at clothing, looking back through the Middle Ages, for example, if you were caught wearing clothing that was not assigned to your gender or class, you could be arrested and killed. So you could be executed for wearing clothing that was not of your assigned gender. Now, as we move through history, we see that there are other times when you would have just been shunned for wearing inappropriate clothing. And again, looking at it from a modern time, oh, well, being shunned, people say tisk tisk and look down their nose at you. Shunning completely cut you out of society, which meant that if you walked into the baker's shop to buy bread to eat for dinner or to feed your family, if you were a shunned woman for wearing men's clothing, you would not be served. You would be turned away and you wouldn't be able to buy bread. If you walked into the butcher shop to try to find meat, you wouldn't be served. You couldn't buy food. If you went to any of the stalls in the produce market, no one would sell to you. And so you would be refused goods and services. And even some would think, well, at least you could go to church and maybe, someone at the church would help you out. You would be refused at the door and the doors would be slammed in your face because you had dressed indecently. And so, because of these societal standards, there was not any room to move outside of that and to push against those established boundaries. And so, if a woman were to say, I'm done with wearing this restrictive corset, I'm done with wearing all of these skirts, it would be so much easier if I could just throw on a pair of trousers and head out the door, that would not have been something that would have been possible for most people in Western society because they would have either been arrested, executed, or shunned publicly. And so with the shunning, even until you served your time of being ashamed and came back to the established norms and told the community, hey, sorry about that, I'm back to expectations, you wouldn't be able to survive unless you could grow and produce in your own home everything that you needed to survive. And so there was extreme pressure to conform to what was considered the norms. And then on top of that, we have expectations for men and women based on religious standards of the time. And so it was seen as an affront to God if women were wearing something that was similar to trousers. So if you had a garment that covered your legs and had a crotch in it, that was seen as being extremely disrespectful to God's creation of the differences of men and women. And so women did not wear undergarments that had any sort of legs to them. And so you just wore skirts, basically. And we'll go over all the fun different layers that women put on. But you never would have thought to put on a garment that had a crotch in it, because that would have been an affront to God, because he created you differently than man. And so we have to put ourselves back in the belief systems that were a part of everyday life, the belief systems that everyone there took as law, that you didn't push against those, you didn't change those. And so in order for women to be able to rebel against those norms or push back against those norms, women had to have some kind of power. And so we start to see through history that when we have times when women were allowed to be educated, even in the smallest areas, even in art and music, which were often seen as women's fields, you could be educated in art and music and some history and, of course, religious studies, but, math and science, that was for men only. But even granting women education in those areas gave them the ability to have some sense of power to create a way to push back against those standards and those norms. So a couple great historic examples. If you've been watching Bridgerton on TV, it is a TV show that's set in the Regency era, late 1700s, early to mid 1800s. If you're thinking visually, it's the time when women were wearing the dresses with the high waistline that went right underneath the bust line. So during that period, women stopped wearing a lot of restrictive undergarments, and it became very fashionable for you to see a woman's figure beneath her clothing. Thus, we have those simple fashions, light fabrics, you can see her silhouette. And so we have women who are gaining more education. And again, we're talking about those of means, but women have more education, they have more control over what they're wearing, and we see a complete reduction of those restrictive undergarments. But then, of course, history changes again, and we're moving into different periods. And when you think about the Victorian era or Victorian corsets, the Victorians wore a corset that went from above the bust to mid-hip. So imagine from mid-chest to mid-hip, you can't bend or move. It's very tight, so you can't breathe very well. You have lovely posture, but it's not a practical garment for everyday use. We see again, and I love, Teresa, that you mentioned the bicycle. The invention of the bicycle changed so many things for women, but we also have the Industrial Revolution happening where women have free time. And for the first time in our history, women have free time that is not based around their household, so raising their family, creating food, etc. So young women who were working in the factories would have a day off, and this was a new amazing thing to have in society. And so women started being more active, and so because of that, that ability to have the time to pursue things other than your home life, that changed women's needs and gave them that power to say, hey, we want to be able to participate. We have the time and the means now to participate, but our clothing is very restrictive. And so you'll have to come to my talk to hear more about Lady Harberton and the Rational Dress Society. But we start to see people like Lady Harberton in London. We start to see Amelia Bloomer here in the United States. But we see women all over start pushing back against these norms that had been established about women's clothing, and saying we need something that is practical, that is healthy, and that allows us to participate in all of these different activities. So we got lots of peaks and valleys as we go. And then more recently, talking about the undergarments with a crotch in it, I'll give you some fun trivia. Again, you got to come to my talk, but fun trivia about how women started wearing crotches. But by the time we get to the 1970s, we still have women wearing undergarments that are restrictive, that are considered to be expected in public spaces. And so a woman going without a bra, where you could see the actual shape and curvature of her breasts, would have been completely indecent in the 1960s. But by the late 1960s, early 1970s, we have a lot of women standing up for women's rights in the workplace, women's rights within their marriage. And that's when we see women taking off their undergarments. And, we've got the bra burnings where women are taking off their bras and saying, I don't want to be restricted based on what my body looks like and based on my gender. I want to be able to participate as an equal. And so, getting rid of the undergarments that had been up to that point a requirement to cover everything was one way that women did that. And then we start to see fashion adjust, and we start to see those light, simple, natural bras coming out in the 70s that offered support and protection, but were made of a different fabric. So rather than to hide, disguise, or reshape the bust, it actually just allowed you to have your natural bust showing in your garments as you were, walking through the day. And so we see that change where society is creating standards, and then we have women pushing against those standards. And sometimes we make change, sometimes we don't make change, but it's incremental. And so we start to see those patterns come and go. And I think it's fascinating that we had corsets back in style, or over the last 10 years or so, where women were reshaping their bodies using corsets to create that tiny waistline once again. And so, this one at least is by choice. There isn't a lot of societal pressure that you have to do that. But you could argue that there's pressure that in order to look attractive, that's the shape that you want to achieve. And so we'll have some fun discussions later too about what that means to be attractive, and what your undergarments do for you, because that's definitely something that we still have, is that balance between what's practical, what's attractive, what's expected.
Right. Thank you, Diane, so much.
Yeah.
I want to sort of touch on something that you both are already talking about and mentioning, right? The backlash that all of this created, right? Like women being refused goods and services because they're wearing A or because they're driving, right? So can you both just share a little bit, if you have a story or two about the backlash that these freedoms start to produce? I would love to hear some. So Teresa, if it's okay, let's go back to you.
Hey, well, before the Yellowstone Trail, the Transcontinental Highway, 1909, there was a young woman named Alice Ramsey, and came from a wealthy background, and she had a car, and she and three of her best friends decided they were going to do something revolutionary. They were going to drive the entire United States. And they let it be known, they sent out a press release, but the press found out about it, and they were pretty much mocked in their hometown that they would even consider doing something like this, but they persevered. They got in the car, they headed out. Now, this is before good roads. This is before maps. We're just headed west. We're going to find our way west. They had to learn basic mechanics to fix the car along the way. They had to learn to change their tires, and they had to figure out where to go since they didn't have maps. They followed the telegraph wires in many places in order to get across the country. And they had a wonderful time, but all along the way, they were harassed by the newspaper media. They were considered incompetent and emotionally unstable. They were accused of neglecting their domestic duties because they were doing this. When they made it all the way to San Francisco, and you would think that that would be a cause of celebration, it took them 59 days, and they proved that you can drive from one end of the country to the other. But once again, they were ridiculed. They were so ridiculed that the newspapers insisted that they must have had secret partners that were actually doing the driving because a woman couldn't possibly do that. This was too extraordinary an accomplishment for a woman. But things were changing. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different societal changes. And by the time we get to 1925, you would expect that maybe the media would be catching up with these changes. Well, there was a cartoon in the Seattle newspaper, and the cartoon is a lovely line drawing of a flapper girl. And of course, I loved flapper girl outfits. They were amazing. And behind her is a sleek roadster type car in this picture. But the caption of the Seattle newspaper was, "Many a girl who can run an 8-cylinder car can't operate a 1-cylinder stove."
Oh my gosh.
So the implication being that if you are, brash enough to get out there and drive, you're going to be neglecting your family, and you're not going to understand your place or the womanly arts of cooking for your family if you're going to be out there running around on the road.
Gosh. Wow. Wow. Diane, please go ahead.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. Thinking of maybe just one particular garment or one point in history where where we had conflict. What's fun is recently in 2008, in Austria they were remodeling one of the castles there, and as they were remodeling and pulling things apart, they found this kind of a chamber where old garments had just kind of been thrown, and so they weren't sure if it was a depository for old things that were going to be then, like given away or sold or mended, or whether it was just kind of the garbage dump of clothing or what this was. But they found a repository of all of this old clothing, and because it had been kind of sealed in this vault-like area within the castle, things had been really well preserved. And the one thing that stood out was there is a garment there that looks like a modern bra. And this is dating back to somewhere between 1480 and 1500. So we're talking medieval times. And so we've seen corsetry, since 1600, BCE. But thinking about the design of a bra, we thought that the bras came to us much more recently. And so as they looked at these garments and said, gosh, how did we miss this? That's when, again, we have to stop and think, what was life like back then? And so even today, when you think about what garments are important to you that you want to pass down, so it's very important sometimes for people to pass their wedding clothes down. How many people have been able to wear their mother's wedding dress, or even in some paintings, you have to kind of look at the age of the paintings because it was fashionable for people to wear the garments of their ancestors when they were having their portrait done. And so, as a historian looking at fashion history, I have to look at when the painting was actually created rather than looking at the clothing styles in that portrait, because they could be wearing clothing that's 100 years old. And so looking at this, how did we miss these bras? Well, you don't hand your daily underwear down to your kids. You don't like pop off your panties and say, here honey, here's my everyday panties that I've worn for 3 months, and the waistband's coming off and there's a hole in the leg, but here you go, I'd like you to have this for posterity. We don't hand down this simple tools that are just a part of our days that are kind of taken for granted. And so not having seen bras handed down the way that we see other items, is something that was shocking. Wow, we actually had these far earlier than we thought. But again, corset design, corsets were made out of leather. They had bone stays in them, or pieces that kept them solid. So even the historic corsets were made out of materials that would have lasted so that we could find them and study them. But when you make something out of a soft linen, because you want that up against your body, it's not going to survive. And so it was really exciting to find the bras. But then looking at history, why hadn't we heard about these? We also had men looking at the texts from historic sources saying, oh, well, yeah, there's a conversation here at this time period about breast bags, or shirts with bags that women were wearing. And so the historians that were researching this just thought, well, it's probably something to do with breastfeeding. We don't get it. We don't know. I don't know. So they just kind of breezed over it. But after finding the bras, looking back at those texts, oh, they were talking about bras. And so there's a fantastic conversation in writing between all of these different writers that were either publishing, at that time publishing, like having copies of their ideas spread around, or that were documented in their journals, that breast bags were extremely controversial in the early 1500s, because what women were wearing a garment that showed off the natural shape of the breast. And so rather than robes or, again, other things that kind of mask the breast, if you are wearing a bra that has individual cups with the band and the shoulder straps that is supporting the breast and holding it in a comfortable position, you're going to be able to see that shape through the garments, as opposed to when a breast is laying up against the body and can be shielded. And so one gentleman talked about how the breast bags were entirely indecent and that women needed to stop wearing them, and that this was just terrible. Whereas another man, who remained anonymous, talked about how fantastic they were because young men could see the shape of a woman's breast. Things don't change a whole lot. And so we have this fantastic debate happening, again, in early 1500, in medieval times, about whether a woman should have an undergarment that supports the breast in a position where it could be visible through the clothing, or whether she should not wear that because it's an indecent use of clothing. So there's our first bras, the breast bags.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, I know we're a little
I'm
over.
going to write that down. I need to tell my children, like, would you like to inherit my breast bag?
Exactly. Yeah, it had lace. It had a lace trim on it as well. Truly, when you see the photos, which you'll get to see in my talk, it's fantastic because it looks like it could have been made, in modern times. It's a fantastic design, and truly, his clothing historians had no idea that they dated back that technology to design and tailor that dated back so far.
Wow, wow. Well, I know we're a little bit on time and I want to be very respectful, but I just want to, if you have any final thoughts that you want to share, any final questions or just, reflections in these 5 minutes that we have, please. I just want to
Well, I
hold
just want
space.
to bring up a couple of more plucky girls that I just think, well, actually, one, I'm not going to call her a plucky girl. I'm going to call her a law and order warrior. So those of you from Seattle probably remember the name Bertha Knight Landis. Is that how you pronounce her last name? But anyway, Bertha was one of the first city council women in Seattle in 1922. And in 1924, the mayor, who had the opportunity to go to a conference, decided, since Bertha had become the council president, that she should take over for him while he was away. But he wasn't expecting much. But what she did was absolutely amazing. She took her job very seriously. So while the mayor was away, she fired the police chief. And then she told the police, I want you to go down there and shut down the illegal lotteries, the punch boards and speakeasy. We're going to clean up the city. Well, the mayor comes back, retakes his role, and promptly reverses a bunch of what she did, including rehiring the police chief. But she wasn't done. She was still on the council. And the way this ties in to Pavement and Plucky Girls is that she went on to advocate for improvements in transportation and public parks and public utilities, all while she was doing financial reform in the government. And if we fast forward to today, Seattle children had a contest where they picked the name for the tunnel boring machine that created the tunnel that replaced the Alaskan viaduct, the Alaskan Way viaduct. They named it Bertha after
Oh,
her. So I thought that was so cool. But going back to the time frame where I like to live, which is the Roaring 20s, I would have loved to have been back then. In the summer of 1922, we had a couple of young ladies who went traveling. Now, they were from Wisconsin. They traveled all the way down into Arizona, New Mexico, California. Then they came up to Seattle and they took the Yellowstone Trail back to Wisconsin. But along the way, they just thumbed their nose up at all of the expectations for young women at the time. For one thing, they traveled without a male escort. They wore pants, which in some states was still illegal to wear pants. And one thing they did, which I am not advocating, they hitchhiked during this journey, and sticking to good roads, but they hitchhiked and they worked on farms in order to finance their journey. But lastly, they were packing. They were packing pistols. And so along the way, they actually got arrested 3 different times. Now, they were only 17 and 18 years old. And so the sheriffs would contact their parents to make sure that they actually had permission to be on the road. And just kind of a spoiler alert, they got away every single time. In fact, one of the jailers was so smitten with these young women, he gave them flowers through the bars of the jail cell to perk up their mood. And the last leg of their journey, though, it took them along the Yellowstone Trail from Seattle to Wisconsin. And all along the way, they were interviewed a lot of different times. And in this case, they must have been very charismatic because the joy and enthusiasm of them just came through in these interviews. They were independent, they were confident, they were willing to work along the way, and they certainly didn't let society tell them what they were supposed to do or where they were supposed to go.
oh, that's so inspiring. Diane, please.
Well, I want you to think about it where you were in 1993. Now, if you hadn't been born yet, this was 33 years ago. Think about where your family was in 1993 or what you know about the early 90s. So 1993, 33 years ago. Now, I'm going to jump back. We're going to be back to that. I just want you to think about that time frame for a minute. So going back in history, back into early medieval times, when a man and a woman were married, marriage granted the husband the legal rights to sexual access anytime that he wanted. And so the duty of a wife was to provide sexual access anytime that her husband desired that. And so undergarments fall into that relationship. And so, again, when we're looking back on that, a lot of us might be feeling, wait a minute, that was the standard expectation, and that was also seen as a religious mandate. And so that is, again, a part of Western civilization that has followed through an extremely long timeline. And so when you think about when we didn't have a lot of clothing technology, if you were cold, you just wore lots of layers. And so when you see medieval women in those paintings, they would have a dress on the outside, typically a wool dress, but they might have up to 6 different skirts underneath that wool dress to protect them and keep them warm. And so you've got all kinds of layers on there to protect you, provide warmth, provide comfort throughout your day, whatever you were doing. And so you would have multiple layers of clothing on. And so in order to provide that access to your husband, you would need to have a quick and easy way to get there. And so wearing an undergarment or something that covered that area could make it difficult for you to maintain the duty that you had to your husband. And so even as we get to the extreme corsetry, where we've got, the corsets and the fancy dresses, and, you think about the women with the big wigs from the 1700s and all of the things, they still might have had multiple skirts on underneath because they still wore layers for protection, for fashion, and for warmth. But you would still have access there to meet the needs of your marriage. When we think about that, again, it's like, wow, that's just crazy. That's wild. But 33 years ago was the first time in the United States that we had laws protecting women in that area. And so up until 1976, so I would have been 4 years old, 1976, states in America still had laws on the books that separated the definition of marital rape from anyone else rape. And so marital rape was not considered an offense up until 1976. And so that's when states started to make those changes. And like I mentioned earlier, women were really pushing strongly for their rights in society. And so we've started to see states changing those laws and including that as a right to women to choose when they wanted to engage in sexual activities within their marriages. But it wasn't until 1993, 33 years ago, that nationally a law was put in place giving women the right to choose when they wanted to be sexually engaged within their marriages. And so when we think about that, that was a right that was earned not too long ago legally, but a right that, again, many of us would be like, harumph right now, how can that be? Women in Western history have not held that right for very long. And that's why it's important for us to look at history to understand these things and to see that this is not something we want to take for granted, because that's this much time in the history of Western civilization that women have had a right to choose when they want to have a sexual relationship within their marriage. And so history is fun, amazing, fantastic to look back at. But it's also very important for us to understand that we need to continue to fight to maintain these rights because this is a new one that we don't want to lose. So that's, yeah.
Oh my God. Well, thank you so much, Diane and Teresa, for this super rich and engaging conversation. I mean, one takeaway for me is, celebrating Women's History Month. It's kind of like listening to both of your talks, and well, a little peek into both of your talks is, history isn't only shaped by these major events, right? But it's shaped by daily choices, ordinary objects, and the courage, right, to bend or break expectations from society. And so from undergarments to, how women traveled the roads, I think these stories, both of your stories, right, help us understand how freedom and choice and identity are something that, it's built over time. So to learn more about Diane and Teresa's talk, or book them, please visit our website. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for spending part of it with us. So thank you, Diane and Teresa, so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.